Hello, how does your company become an inflation winner? Well, the answer is simple. Train your staff, train your key decision makers. Warren Buffett's performance in the 1970s tells you why this is so important. We had a major inflation crisis during the 1970s, exactly between 1973 and 1982. If you look at share price development of companies during that time, you see very clearly there were two groups, inflation winners and inflation losers. Warren Buffett's company Berkshire Hathaway was a clear inflation winner. In that period, 1973 to 1982, Warren Buffett's share price, or Berkshire Hathaway's share price, went up by almost 900%. He turned inflation risks into an opportunity, an exceptional opportunity. But now look at the S&P 500, you might say the rest of corporate America. Their share prices during that time went up barely 90%, not enough to manage to break through the inflation benchmark for that period, almost 10 years of time, which was 130%. They were clearly the inflation losers. They did not understand how this game worked. Now, you have two choices. You can try to become an inflation winner. What do you have to do? You have to understand the new rules of the game. And your staff has to be trained so they make the right decisions reflecting inflation reality. Everything turns around in inflation and you need to understand how this new world works. Otherwise, like in the 1970s, you will be in the big group of inflation losers. Let me make it a little bit more specific. Let's look at history. We had two big eras. From 1950s to 1982, the period of rising inflation and rising interest rates. Then, in 1982, inflation was beaten by President Reagan and Fed Chair Paul Volcker. And during that time, when you look at the development here, interest rates went continuously down and provided a nice tailwind for businesses. But that era is over. We might as well see something again that looks like the 1950s to 1980s. And such a period requires different decision making by all people in your company. Let's look into this in a little bit more detail. What is inflation? Inflation is a process. It's not a single event. That's one of the biggest mistakes people make. And in my 4 phases inflation management model, I separated inflation into 4 different phases. Pre-inflation, you see the green, everything is great. Corporate earnings, interest rates are low, credit is available, and so on. Then comes the inflation shock. Inflation unexpectedly goes up and the whole world changes. But then it goes on. We reach a period of inflation plateau. So inflation stays at a high level and prepares for phase 4, disinflation or normalization, and then it goes down again. Each phase needs different decisions and different thinking and different strategies. You need to be prepared for this. You cannot approach inflation as one simple event. It comes in phases. Each phase needs a different vulnerability analysis and strategy and different decisions. The most important phase, or the most dangerous one, is the inflation shock and the inflation surge. We see that in the 1970s. You see here real GDP between 1972 and 1975. It was in a great world and it collapsed. Recession for 2 years. Unemployment rate shot up and the equity market lost almost half of its value because simply the S&P 500 companies, most of them were not prepared. They didn't understand how to deal with inflation, or back then stagflation. You can do better. You can learn from the 4 phases inflation management model, which I have described in great detail in my book, The Return of High Inflation, published in 2016, was one of the first global experts who warned about inflation at almost 6 years ago. And what you have to understand is you can use this tool to guide you through your decision making and through your strategic thinking. What's important is there are the red points that are strategic turning points. That means you get into the next phase. You need to prepare. You need to change your decision making, your thinking, your strategies. And obviously, you need to do a vulnerability analysis. How well will I do in the next phase with my current setup, with my current strategy? Now, inflation is never a straight line, and that makes it a little bit demanding. But if you know the history of inflation, you can very well manage through this period. So, for example, in the 1970s, a lot of people got trapped by a return of high inflation. So inflation first went up, went down, and you see here the classical 4 phases inflation management model from inflation shock, plateau, disinflation 75 to 76, and then everybody thought we won, we go back to normal life. No, because the same mistakes were done again by decision makers in central banks and in politics. And in 1977 to 1970-80, we had another inflation shock. That was an even more severe shock. You need to understand these things can happen. You can look at this on this chart, which shows you the consumer price index, and it shows you 3 peaks. In my classes on inflation management training, I explained to you why these peaks happened and why inflation came back and why was it defeated at the end. There are some clear signs that you have to look for to determine inflation is finally over. You learn this in my workshop on inflation management. So if you want to be an inflation winner, what do you have to do? You have to do basically 3 things. You have to train all your key staff in inflation management. Everybody who makes consequential decisions in your company. The second activity is you have to understand your vulnerability and inflation readiness. And this needs to be done for each single phase of an inflation process. And then at the last, once you understand inflation, you can try, like Warren Buffett did, to turn inflation risks into an exceptional opportunity. You can learn in my case study on Warren Buffett how he did it. There's a lot that you can copy for your own company. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is one thing. Start immediately to train your staff in inflation management. How inflation works. What are the inflation mechanics and their impact on decision making? What are the lessons learned from the 70s? Best and worst case examples. Who to train? Board members. Don't forget, board members and supervisory board members. Business and functional leaders and any staff that makes key decisions in your company. You can book my workshops in a virtual setting or in person, and I'm looking forward to working with you. Give me a call or send me an email, and the Vanchi Group, which is the consulting boutique that I founded, is happy to work with you. I wish you all the best, and I hope this information was helpful to you, even if you are not working with me. But please look for training opportunities for your staff. That's the key step to bring you closer to becoming an inflation winner. And I'm sure you want to be one of the inflation winner and come as close to Warren Buffett's outperformance, gigantic outperformance, as possible. Thank you very much for your attention, and please give me a call or contact me if you're interested in exploring further cooperation. Goodbye.